Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. As you all know, and if you might remember from last season of State of the World and every other event you may have been in, we're going to give it a couple seconds to let everyone join us in the Zoom webinar room. And we'll also be live on Facebook. So if you're joining us there, welcome. And thank you so much for being here today. I know we do have a lot to get to. So as people are coming in, I'm just going to kick us off with a quick welcome. Thank you so much for joining the World Affairs Council of Connecticut to discuss U.S. foreign policy priorities in a new administration with special guest, Senator Chris Murphy. Senator Murphy, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yep, thanks for having me. Great to be back.
My name is Amanda Jolly, VP of Programs with the Council, and today's structure will kick off with a conversation between Senator Chris Murphy and Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. Again, Senator Murphy, we're honored to have you here today with us to discuss U.S. foreign policy priorities in the new administration. So let's get started. I'm pleased to turn it over to you, Megan. Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As we open, I want to say that as I was watching Senator Murphy live on Facebook last week on the floor of the Senate, speaking about Yemen, and I saw all of the comments scrolling, I was poignantly struck about the fact that foreign policy and US leadership in the world is not just something that happens in Washington, D.C. It's not just something that is relegated to the State Department or think tanks. US leadership in foreign policy impacts each and every single one of us Americans. And at the World Affairs Council, we get the great opportunity to connect our communities to global issues. And it couldn't be a more critical time in history to do that. And I know that there is nobody who understands that more than our Senator from the state of Connecticut, Chris Murphy. So thank you again, Senator, for joining us. And I'm gonna just jump right in. We're at, like I said, we're in a time of rapid change. We have a new US administration taking the helm that's going to have a stark departure from those of the previous administration. The coronavirus pandemic continues to threaten the health, stability, and economies of the world. Social movements for justice are challenging institutions that underpin our nation and the world. Can you set the scene for us in the midst of everything? Where do we start? What are the top foreign policy priorities that the Biden administration must address first?
Well, Megan, thanks for having me. Great to be back with the council. Thanks for all the great work that you do to elevate these issues and to promote, public dialogue outside of Washington, D.C. Listen, I know it sometimes feels cliche when we say that, all domestic policy is foreign policy, but in this case, it's never been truer. Unless we get our hands wrapped around coronavirus here in the United States, we really have very little ability to be able to defend our interests abroad. China is walking around the world today making the claim that democracy isn't worthwhile because look how quickly we were able to get our hands around coronavirus and look at all the democracies, the United States and those in Europe, that are having much more trouble. And so we have to show now, with Biden firmly in control, the ability of a democracy with the emergency powers that we grant executives inside that democracy, the ability to be able to turn the corner on the virus. It has real practical considerations as well. I literally just finished up a conversation with my foreign policy advisor about the inability of members of Congress to travel to represent the United States abroad because of coronavirus restrictions. So this is a moment where we won't be very successful in effectuating foreign policy goals unless we get our domestic crises in order. But you have to walk and chew gum at the same time. So that means there is a sort of early lineup for the Biden administration. First and foremost, it's about rebuilding alliances. In a multipolar world today, you just can't, defend yourself unless you have friends. And, we saw that with respect to the disastrous economic negotiations with China. The United States didn't really get anything over 4 years of the Trump administration because we were going it alone. So putting ourselves back in a position specifically with respect to the transatlantic alliance where we have common purpose, common cause, common strategy, really important. And I think you sort of saw a sliver of what's to come late last night, early this morning, when the G7 put out a very strong statement on Myanmar. And well, maybe it didn't have sort of specific reference to sanctions, as some might have liked. This is the kind of communications, the kind of solidarity that's really important for the United States moving forward. Obviously, President Biden's done some things already to reestablish our global reputation, re-entering Paris and the WHO. I hope that the Iran nuclear agreement is on that list and just around the corner. We've got to sort of show the priority we place on diplomacy, and President Biden has already begun to reaffirm that commitment, but there's more to be said. And then lastly, I think Congress has a real responsibility to better equip this administration with the tools to succeed. Hopefully we'll get into this conversation later on, but every American president is going to fail internationally if we spend 20 times as much money on the military as we do on diplomacy and international aid. Today, the threats that are posed to the United States are by and large not conventional military threats. Witness 400,000 Americans dead from a foreign invasion. It was just a virus rather than an army. And I think a lot of Americans are looking at the way we spend money and saying, does it really make sense to spend $700 billion on the military and $10 billion on global public health, given what we just went through? We've got to commit ourselves to a reallocation of spending. That's a job Congress needs to step up to the plate and do.
So you just mentioned the Paris Climate Accords, and one of the things that you talk a lot about is climate change and climate change policy. And you recently wrote an article in Foreign Policy that America must reclaim the global lead on climate change. How much ground do you think that we've lost, and what are some of the specific steps we can take as a nation to reestablish leadership on climate change?
Well, I think we've lost a tremendous amount of ground. And we're dealing with a problem that has a clock on it, right? There is a point at which there's so much there's so much greenhouse gas pollutants in the atmosphere that you cannot reverse the trend in a way to save the planet, right? We've got about a decade. If we don't make significant changes in the next 10 years, my kids won't have the opportunity to fix this problem. So there's real urgency. And the difficulty here is that, well, Biden is going to try to come back to the table. He's going to try to pass something domestically to give ourselves the moral authority to lead internationally. The rest of the world right now just doesn't trust the United States because they look at our politics with, half of the political establishment in Washington, D.C. effectively denying that global warming exists. And they say to themselves, okay, so I'm going to make a deal with the Biden administration, but as soon as Republicans get back in charge, they're going to pull out. And so until we fix our domestic politics, until we sort of defeat the global warming deniers, it makes it really hard for President Biden or Tony Blinken to be able to go out and, build an international consensus. They will try, they may be successful. It will help if we pass something domestically, and frankly, something that can't be reversed, right? So I would recommend the Biden administration, listen, I'm for carbon repricing, cap and trade, carbon tax, but I'd probably advocate that we spend more time doing green infrastructure investment, right? Building wind turbines and solar panels and geothermal farms, because that's the kind of commitment that can't be deconstructed. And that might make the world a little bit more convinced that we're in this for the long haul. So yeah, I think there's enormous damage that's been done, continues to be done so long as our politics on this issue continue to be so catastrophic.
So let's pivot to Yemen for a minute, because it's an issue that you have been speaking about for a long time. And we know that during Secretary of State Blinken's confirmation hearing, he affirmed that the Biden administration would end U.S. support for the military campaign led by Saudi Arabia and Yemen. You've addressed this need since 2015. Why is this a policy imperative for the U.S.?
Well, because the civil war in Yemen has been a national security disaster in every single way for the United States. We're a participant in the civil war. We provide the Saudis with all sorts of assistance, including the weaponry and the bombs that they drop and use. What we know is that inside Yemen, a place where 100,000 kids have died of starvation and disease, 17,000 civilians have died, many of them deliberately being targeted by these bombing campaigns, they blame the United States. They blame Saudi Arabia too, but there's a U.S. imprint on every civilian death inside Yemen, and we are radicalizing a generation of Yemenis against the United States. And our participation in that war is being used as bulletin board material for terrorist recruiters all over the globe. In addition, AQAP, which is the wing of al-Qaeda that has the clearest designs to attack the United States, they take advantage of the Yemen civil war. They control territory. They are able to organize and potentially mount plans to attack the United States. From a security perspective, this is a disaster, but just from a moral perspective, the United States should never be part of a military campaign that is violating openly human rights laws. And so it's really important for us to get out of this war because it is on its own terms, national security and a national security humanitarian disaster, but it just makes the United States look so terrible and ultimately provides, as I said, recruitment material for the worst of the extremist organizations all around the world. By the way, we need to have a broader conversation about reorienting our policy towards the Gulf, towards Saudi Arabia, towards UAE, but this is the place that we should start.
Yeah, do you want to expand a little bit on how do we reset that Saudi relationship? How do we reset that relationship with UAE?
Well, today, we export more oil and gas than we import. I mean, we are just not as reliant on Saudi and Emirati produced natural resources as we were, when Jimmy Carter famously said that any security attack on our partners in the Middle East would be perceived as an attack against the United States. Right now, are in a different position where we are sort of less reliant on that region. In addition, the record of, in particular, the Saudis on human rights is getting worse and harder for us to justify through silence. We look hypocritical when we're trying to sort of protect democracies in other parts of the world, and we're sitting by idly as the Saudis chop up journalists and imprison women who are just seeking the right to drive a car. We need to more broadly desecuritize our relationships in the Middle East. We have to make a decision that it really isn't in our long-term interest to play such an active role in the set of proxy wars between the Iranians and the Saudis. And it doesn't mean that we aren't still partners with the Saudis and the Emiratis. It means that we just aren't backing every single one of their security plays in the region, especially when their security objectives don't align with our security objectives. I think we just have to be much more choosy than we have been in the past about when we choose to do business with Gulf nations. And we have to draw a harder line and say, if you want to be security partners with the United States, then you've got to change your record on human rights. You've got to sue for peace in Yemen. We should sort of call their bluff. A lot of times folks say, well, if the United States doesn't sell drones to the Emiratis, somebody else will. There's still no substitute for the United States as a security partner. The Chinese really don't want to get their hands that dirty in the security contests of the Middle East. The Russian stuff they sell is not comparable to the stuff we sell. We can draw a firmer line when it comes to what we expect from our partners in the region for security partnership with the United States.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm going to bring in a few audience questions. We have a few questions in that want to talk about Burma, that want to talk about Myanmar. What do you think the U.S. approach should be to the situation that is happening now? And we know that you have, met with Aung San Suu Kyi, in specifically talking about her treatment of the refugees. But what is your take on what is happening?
Well, listen, Myanmar is as everybody knows, a very complicated country, a country that had this very slow, torturous transition to democracy, a country where even before this coup, the military played an outsized role in the administration of the country. What is necessary right now is multilateral cooperation. That's why that G7 statement is so important. If we're going to move forward with a conversation about, for instance, sanctions on the individuals who enacted this coup, then we need to do it in a way that squares with our allies. It will be feckless if it's the United States alone. It stands, though, in context. What's happening in Myanmar is, of course, not unfamiliar because we have seen a backsliding from democracy all over the world, in the Philippines, in Turkey, in Hungary, in Poland. And it is not coincidental to the period of time over the last 4 years where the United States just disappeared when it came to democracy promotion, where we cozied up to dictators, essentially signaling to would-be military autocrats that you have a future with the United States if you sort of shove democracy aside. President Biden's got a job ahead of him to sort of rally the world again around promoting democracy. And then once, back to my hobby horse, Congress needs to produce new tools for the administration to use to promote democracy. In a fledgling democracy like Myanmar, one of the big issues there is information. Are there independent, objective journalists, right, who can cover what's happening to the Rohingyas, who can tell the story of why democracy is important, who can root out corruption? It's really hard to find those sources in a place like Myanmar. The United States can help. And so that's why standing up and improving upon our capacities to project independent journalism through the Global Engagement Center, for instance, of the State Department, are really critical in Myanmar and in all of the other cases around the world that look a little bit like Myanmar.
Excellent. So let's move to a question from Fred, who is the founder of the Ghanaian American Journal, which is here in Connecticut. So considering the lack of clarity during the Trump administration about its foreign policy goals on the African continent, what can we expect from the Biden administration about U.S. foreign policy priorities for Africa? Do you think they'll be focused on strengthening business and trade relationships, or limited to sort of advocating for democratic governance alone, or will it be something else?
Well, I'm maybe not in a position to sort of predict what Biden's Africa policy is going to be, so I won't necessarily speak for the president or his team. But what I know is this: there is tremendous opportunity on the African continent for the United States to be a player in economic development and democracy promotion. Again, it is just a matter of whether we are willing to deploy the tools necessary to be a partner there. No secret why China has a ton of influence on the continent. They're willing to put serious money to economic development projects, often with strings attached to it that probably in the long run don't make that partnership worthwhile. But these nations are crying out for an alternative to Chinese investment, and they don't have it today. We have reformed our international development finance capacity in the United States. It's now called the Development Finance Corporation, but it is still a shadow of the Chinese state function with respect to international development finance. So we need to supersize our Development Finance Corporation here in the United States, so it really can compete with China and in Africa for development opportunities. Similarly, we need to reckon with how we spend other kind of assistance money. Right now, we have this big slush fund at the Department of Defense. A lot of that money ends up going to Africa in order to securitize problems that are really political in nature. So we send a lot of security aid to unstable places that often ends up in the hands of regimes that are engaged in the brutal treatment and repression of people, which gives rise to instability. Instead of spending billions of dollars in unaccountable security assistance on the African continent, why not repurpose and reprogram that money for economic development, democracy aid, anti-corruption programs? Most likely would be money much better spent. So I think there also has to be a broader reorientation of programming there as well.
So there's a lot of questions here on Iran, so I'm going to try and condense them. So you had mentioned that you hope the U.S. rejoins the JCPOA. What do you see as the best case scenario going forward for the U.S. and for security in the Middle East?
We had done something remarkable at the end of the Obama administration. We had brought together the United States, Europe, China, and Russia on a common Iran policy. That policy began with an agreement in which the Iranians allowed unprecedented and unparalleled international inspection of their nuclear energy program and a commitment to not develop that program into a weapons capacity. And it was set up so that, having secured that multilateral agreement on nukes, we could then move to tackling ballistic missiles and Iran's support for terrorist groups. We never were able to take that next step because Trump pulled us out of the nuclear agreement. So to me, there's great merit in reassembling the JCPOA. Now, that's not easy. But it is also not impossible. I support a compliance for compliance offer to the Iranians, in which we commit to get back into compliance with respect to sanctions, and they agree to get back in compliance with respect to the restraints on a nuclear program. And then we use that coalition reassembled to press them on ballistic missiles, to press them on support for terrorist groups. But again, it all sits in context, right? I mean, I do sit down and talk to Foreign Minister Zarif from time to time, and I take everything he says with a grain of salt. But he does regularly remind those of us who meet with him that his ballistic missiles are pointed at Saudi Arabia. And so long as we continue a record pace of arms sales to the Saudis and Emiratis, we have to understand we are fueling the arms race. We are incentivizing the Iranians to continue to spend more money on weapons development and buildup. And so addressing Iran's ballistic missile program is not just about sanctioning them, using punitive measures to try to get them to act differently. It's also about recognizing that we're taking other steps in the region that ends up providing incentives for the Iranians to continue to grow those capacities.
Excellent. So we have a question here about, how does cybersecurity now factor into foreign policy, especially in light of the recent Russian hack?
We have to have both defensive and offensive capabilities here. And I wish that weren't true. But in order to convince the Russians or the North Koreans or the Chinese to stand down in their attacks against the United States, then they have to know that we have the capability to launch similar attacks against them. That's ultimately, I think, an unfortunate part of our policy here. This is a super difficult question, one that requires a broad reorientation of our defensive arrangements as well. One of the things we have struggled with in the United States is how to integrate public and private sector communication on cyber attacks. The private sector has, in part, long fought greater integration, right? We need to be able to see when China is probing the private sector, whether it be industrial companies or energy companies, so that we can learn about those tactics to protect the broader economy and state entities. And the private sector in the United States has to be open to that kind of cooperation. And then to the extent that we have to engage in pushbacks and sanctions against the Chinese or the Russians, they have to be multilateral. And I feel like I'm coming back to this over and over and over again, but the Chinese aren't going to really pay attention to any retributive policy unless it's coming from the United States and Europe. And right now, honestly, we aren't on the same page on China with the Europeans. We can get there, but they decided to sort of go their own way during the last 4 years.
So believe it or not, we're coming up to our last question. We know that you're going to be in the impeachment trial next week. I wanted to talk a little bit about what happened on January 6th. You've written so eloquently about it, and we know that the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, 2021 was a very dark day in our nation's history. We also know that the images of what happened at the Capitol are being broadcast all over the world, over and over and over again, particularly in China, particularly in Russia. And what that does is feed into the narrative of American decline. And so what do we do? How do we regain our leadership back? And what do you think is our greatest hope going forward?
Well, as we were talking about Myanmar, we were talking about this, global democratic backsliding, and it's happening here in the United States. There are a whole bunch of people, many of them, support President Trump, who are in the process of giving up on democracy, who are willing to listen to other offers, and that's happening in other parts of the world as well. And so if we aren't in a common conversation about what ails democracy, then we're losing. Listen, there needs to be accountability for what happened on January 6th. We have to have an impeachment process. The folks who stormed the Capitol have to go to jail. But we also have to sort of step back and ask ourselves, why are so many people in this country willing to give up on this miraculous experiment of the last 240 years? And why does that look suspiciously like the conversation that's happening in the Philippines and Hungary and Poland and Turkey? And I think there are a couple answers to that. In the United States, I think we have a particular problem in identity. We had a very clear identity for most of the Cold War. It has been hard for us to create that common identity since the fall of Soviet Russia. We've got to figure out what unites us because we're really sure these days what divides us. But then what we have in common with the rest of the world is, I think this: democracy isn't working for a lot of people right now. It just isn't. I mean, it's creating a plutocracy in which billionaires have accumulated $1 trillion in additional wealth during a time over 2020 where 20% of our workforce was out of work or had their hours reduced, where bread lines are once again present on the streets of the United States. And so if we don't fix democracy and make it start working for average people, folks will be justified in starting to question whether they want to invest in another form of government. So that's why the stakes this year are so big for Joe Biden. That's why so many of us believe we have to do something big, right? We have to raise the minimum wage. We have to cut childhood poverty in half. We've got to beat this pandemic in a matter of months because we've got to show to America that democracy can still fix big problems. We've got to show to the world that democracy can still fix big problems. And unless we do that, no democracy promotion program that we fund through USAID is going to be able to meet the moment. So that, I think, is our task, as big as it is, as gargantuan as it is, over the next few months. And listen, I'm just privileged that the people of Connecticut have given me the opportunity and the responsibility to be present for this moment.
We're so lucky to have you, and we're so proud of everything that you're doing and your leadership, in the United States, in Connecticut, and around the world. It's so important to us. And thank you so much for being back on State of the World.
Thanks for all the great work you do, Megan. I appreciate joining you all.
Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today. Senator Murphy, thank you so much for being here. We want to thank everyone once again for being here with us today. We encourage you to check out Senator Murphy's latest article in Foreign Policy, America Must Reclaim the Lead on Climate Change. And we want to thank you in particular for joining us for this event, as it is the first event of the season for this series of State of the World. Coming up this season, we'll tackle everything from domestic terrorism to human trafficking, misinformation around human trafficking, and from the Iran deal to China's new digital currency. So next week, we'll be speaking with Stephanie Foster on what a feminist foreign policy would look like in the U.S. So we hope you can join us. And to make sure you don't miss an episode, visit our website at ctwac.org, subscribe to our YouTube channel at World Affairs Council of Connecticut, or subscribe to the State of the World podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. So once again, thanks to Senator Murphy for sharing your leadership with us today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And until next time.